When 11-year-old Jeremy Odom stepped onto the threshold of the Gallo mansion, the world inside came to a standstill. His face, bruised and swollen from his stepfather's rage, told one story, but his words shattered the room in a way nothing else could. "Can you be my dad for one day?" The silence that followed was deafening. Jeremy's voice, small and trembling, cut through the thick air like a cry for help no one had expected, least of all the Mafia boss who had lived through his own battles. Aristide Gallo, the notorious Mafia don, stared at the boy, his hardened gaze softening as he took in the boy's battered face. His men, rough around the edges, looked from one another in disbelief. Jeremy stood frozen, clutching a worn travel bag, his sneakers worn thin, his small frame trembling. A lifetime of pain and rejection hung in the air between them. "You lost, kid," one of the men asked, his tone skeptical yet curious. But Jeremy didn't flinch. He lifted his chin, the smallest flicker of determination burning in his eyes. "I just need someone to show up for me." His voice cracked as he added, "Can you be my dad for one day? For career day at school, everyone's bringing their parents. But I don't have anyone." Aristide's men shifted uneasily, their faces hardening. For a moment, it seemed like they might send him away. But Aristide saw something in the boy, something that mirrored the loss he had once felt. A story of abandonment, one that tugged at the edges of his own. Aristide nodded slowly, the decision weighing on him. They would do more than show up for Jeremy. They would make him a part of their family. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. The days following Jeremy's request felt like a dream he wasn't sure he was ready to wake up from. Aristide Gallo and his associates, men who had built their lives on strength and fear, had made a decision, one that would change Jeremy's world forever. Instead of being sent away, he was welcomed into their fold. Vito, Marco, and Luca, the closest men to Aristide, were the first to greet him. Each one, despite the hard exterior of their leather jackets and grim expressions, showed a rare softness when speaking to the boy. "You're part of us now," Marco had said, his voice gravelly but warm. "We take care of family." Jeremy didn't know what to expect. The Gallo mansion, once an imposing fortress of wealth and power, now felt like a strange new home. The men who inhabited it, so accustomed to violence and control, were suddenly acting as if they'd always known him. Vito, a burly man with tattoos that covered every inch of his arms, ruffled Jeremy's hair as if he were a son he'd never had. "Don't worry, kid," he chuckled, "we take care of our own." Marco led him to a room on the second floor, one that was neatly furnished with an almost unsettling calmness. It was his room now. Jeremy didn't understand it. How could these men, hardened criminals, the sort of men he'd been taught to fear, be so kind to him? But the warmth in their gestures, the kindness in their eyes, was undeniable. Over the next few days, Jeremy slowly began to adjust to life within the Gallo mansion. At first, it felt surreal. These were men who had made their names feared in the underworld, and yet they showed him more care than anyone ever had before. They introduced him to their world, one where loyalty meant everything, where strength wasn't just about physical power, but about standing by those who needed it most. Vito, Marco, and Luca each took turns speaking with him, explaining the importance of family, protection, and respect. Jeremy learned that, despite the Mafia's brutal reputation, these men valued the people they cared about above all else. Still, a part of him couldn't fully embrace it. His mind kept wandering back to the life he had known, to the house he had fled from. In the quiet moments of the night, when the house was still and the weight of the day settled in, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was an outsider here. The Mafia, despite their promises, were still a world away from the safety and love he had always longed for. And yet, with each passing day, something began to change. Jeremy had never felt what he felt in this house, an odd, yet comforting sense of belonging. It wasn't the same as what he had imagined a family might be, but it was something stronger, forged through loyalty and trust. These men weren't just offering him protection, they were offering him a place to stand tall for the first time in his life. As he sat in the kitchen one evening, Watching Luca and Marco prepare dinner, his mind drifted back to the past. His stepfather, Dale, would have never allowed such an act of care. Jeremy remembered the way Dale had always belittled him, the harsh words that filled the air like poison, stinging his spirit long after the bruises had faded. "You're worthless," Dale would say, every insult cutting deeper than the last. It wasn't just the beatings that had broken him, it was the emotional wounds, the constant barrage of verbal abuse that had made him feel invisible, as though he didn't matter at all. The memory of those words still lingered in the back of his mind, haunting him, even here, in this mansion of unlikely safety. Could these men really be trusted? Could Aristide, who had seen and done things Jeremy could never even imagine, really be the father figure he had always longed for? The first time he tried to speak about his life at home, it came out in fragments, nothing more than broken pieces of a story that he'd never been able to tell anyone. "My real dad," he murmured, his voice barely audible as he stared at his plate. "He died when I was little. I don't really remember him." The pain of it all felt like it was lodged in his throat, too big to express. And his mother, well, she was always busy, working long shifts at the hospital. She was never there to stop Dale from doing what he did. "Dale's the one who did all the bad stuff," Jeremy continued, his voice growing smaller. "He'd say I wasn't worth anything." He could feel the tightness in his chest, the weight of years of suppression, but it felt different here, easier to speak the truth, easier to let someone in. Marco, who had been silent up until that point, simply placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're worth more than you think, kid." Even though the mansion's walls were thick with the history of the Mafia, Jeremy found it easier to breathe here than he had in his own home. The danger that loomed over every conversation didn't feel as heavy as the emotional threat he'd faced in the past. Aristide, though always a distant figure, had begun to speak to him more often. There was a quiet power in the way Aristide carried himself, a commanding presence that made others listen, but it was his actions that truly spoke. He had seen a lot of pain in his life, and perhaps that was why he understood Jeremy's need for a father figure in a way most men couldn't. Aristide's life was full of mistakes, of things that couldn't be undone, but he had his code, his loyalty, his protection, and his deep belief in family. And when he spoke to Jeremy, there was no pretense, no judgment. Just the firm promise of support. "We'll teach you what it means to be strong," Aristide said one night, his voice low and steady. "And we'll show you what family really means." Jeremy couldn't fully comprehend it yet. How could he? He'd spent his entire life with people who told him he wasn't worth protecting, worth caring for. But here, in this house filled with men who had committed crimes that could fill books, he was slowly being shown what it meant to be loved, even if the love came in the most unconventional ways. He wasn't the fragile, beaten boy anymore. Not here, not with these men. But still, the shadows of his past followed him. At school, Jeremy tried his best to keep a low profile. The bullying didn't stop. Even though he felt safer at home, the kids at school were relentless. He wasn't just the fatherless boy, he was the weak one. Nicholas, the bully who had tormented him since first grade, was the worst of them all. Every day, he called Jeremy names, shoved him into lockers, and reminded him of what it was like to have no one. Jeremy hated it. But every time the taunts came, he could feel the security of the Gallo men in his back pocket. He wasn't completely alone anymore. That thought was enough to push him forward, to remind him that he was a part of something now. Something bigger than himself. Something that, for the first time in his life, made him feel like he was truly seen. As the days turned into weeks, Jeremy started to realize that he wasn't just being given a roof over his head. He wasn't just receiving protection. He was being given something far more precious. He was being given a place to stand. To belong. To be part of something that wasn't just about blood, but about the people who chose to show up when it mattered most. And that, Jeremy realized, was more powerful than anything he could have ever imagined. The plan was simple but bold: confront Dale, Jeremy's abusive stepfather, and ensure he would never threaten the boy again. Aristide Gallo had seen men like Dale before, cruel, manipulative, and full of empty bravado, but he knew exactly how to deal with people like him. It wasn't about violence this time. though the Mafia had more than enough firepower to handle any situation. No, this time, it was about dismantling Dale's world through the quiet, powerful weapon of influence. Aristide's network, vast and intricate, would be the instrument of Dale's downfall, exposing the man for what he truly was, a coward hiding behind his cruelty. Vito, Marco, and Luca stood by Aristide's side as the plan began to unfold. The Mafia had resources Dale could never have dreamed of, and they would use every connection, every favor, to make sure the truth about him came to light. Aristide had a reputation for being both feared and respected, but what most didn't know was that his influence went far beyond the criminal world. He had connections with lawyers, journalists, even the police. And it was through these connections that Aristide would dig into Dale's past, uncovering the dark secrets the man thought he could bury forever. He had no idea that the walls around him were about to close in. Jeremy didn't know the full extent of the plan, but he knew something big was happening. Aristide had reassured him that everything would be handled, but the weight of what was coming still hung over him. He couldn't help but feel the tug of guilt, the guilt of knowing that his past, the broken pieces of his life, were about to be laid bare. But as the days passed, he also felt something else, relief. Relief that he wasn't alone in this fight, that the men who had taken him in were committed to seeing this through. They weren't just going to protect him, they were going to destroy everything that had kept him caged, starting with Dale. The first step of Aristide's plan was to dig into Dale's life, to expose the man for what he really was. Aristide's network of informants, legal advisors, and even former associates began their work. They uncovered Dale's past, his criminal activities, and most importantly, the evidence of his abuse toward Jeremy. It wasn't just about the bruises or the black eye Jeremy had endured. It was about the psychological torment, the constant belittling, and the broken promises that had kept Jeremy feeling small for so long. The Mafia's meticulous investigation turned up text messages, financial records, and even witnesses who had seen the man's cruelty firsthand. Aristide knew that armed with this information, Dale would have nowhere to hide. The day of the confrontation arrived, and Aristide's men were ready. They had all the evidence they needed, and Aristide had arranged a meeting with Dale under the guise of a civil conversation. But there was no negotiation. Aristide wasn't interested in hearing Dale's excuses. The Mafia boss arrived at the dilapidated house where Dale was holed up, his expression calm and controlled, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Jeremy. As they walked up to the front door, Aristide motioned for his men to stay back. This wasn't a moment for intimidation. It was about laying the truth out clearly, forcefully, and without mercy. Dale answered the door himself, looking disheveled and defensive. He clearly wasn't expecting company, especially not the Mafia. When he saw Aristide standing there, his face momentarily faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "What do you want?" Dale sneered, attempting to hide the fear creeping into his voice. Aristide stepped forward, his presence filling the doorway. "We need to talk about your treatment of Jeremy," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable authority. The words didn't come as a threat, they came as a promise. Things were about to change. Dale attempted to resist, his mouth running with excuses and half-baked justifications. "You don't know what you're talking about," he shouted, trying to mask the fear now visible in his eyes. "Jeremy's just a kid who doesn't know how to listen." But Aristide wasn't swayed. He let Dale rant, watching the man's defenses crumble piece by piece. "You've hurt him for too long," Aristide said calmly, stepping into the room. "And now, I'm going to make sure you'll never hurt him again." He handed Dale a folder full of evidence, the photos, the messages, the medical records. The man's face strained of color as he read through the documentation, each piece of information pulling the rug out from under him. Aristide didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his words was more than enough to break Dale's resolve. The confrontation didn't turn violent, but the tension was palpable. Aristide's presence was like a tidal wave, slowly but surely erasing any notion that Dale could escape unscathed. The Mafia boss didn't need to shout or threaten, he simply let the truth speak for itself. And as Dale read through the evidence, he knew he was trapped. "You're finished," Aristide said, his voice low but firm. You will leave Jeremy's life, and if you ever come near him again, the world will know what you've done." Dale's defiance melted away as he realized the extent of what had been done. His options were gone, he had no choice but to agree. Dale's reaction was a mix of shock and defeat. He didn't fight back, didn't try to resist any longer. All his bravado had been stripped away, leaving only the broken man who had been hiding behind cruelty for far too long. He muttered something under his breath, a weak attempt at a final defense, but it was hollow. Aristide, with his quiet authority, made it clear that this was the end. Dale was told to leave the house immediately and never return. His personal belongings would be gathered for him, and any attempt to reach out to Jeremy would be met with swift consequences. The man's face twisted with a mix of anger and fear as he realized there was no way out. As Dale was escorted off the property, Jeremy watched from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't known in years: relief. He had always feared that this day would never come, that Dale would always be there to torment him. But now, with Aristide and his men standing by, Jeremy knew that the worst was over. He wasn't just protected by the Mafia, he was free. The nightmare had ended. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who made you feel small or worthless? What did you do to overcome it? Share your thoughts below. If you're enjoying the story and want to see how Jeremy's story continues, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with your thoughts. How do you think the Mafia's influence will change his life next? Let us know. Nicholas had been the source of nearly every nightmare Jeremy had experienced at school. The bullying was relentless, a constant thorn in his side, cutting deeper than any physical wound could. Each day, Jeremy braced himself for the taunts, the shoves, the cruel jokes that always found their mark. "Orphan boy," Nicholas would sneer, always walking around like he's better than the rest of us. Jeremy had learned to shrink in the presence of his tormentor, his shoulders hunched, head low, hoping to escape without further humiliation. But what hurt most wasn't the words or the jabs, it was the fact that there was no escape. At home, things were bad, but at school, they were worse. Nicholas made sure of it. However, things began to shift in a way Jeremy never could have expected. Aristide Gallo, the Mafia boss who had become his unlikely protector, noticed the ongoing torment Jeremy faced. Aristide's men had watched Jeremy closely, noticing the way he carried the weight of the world on his small shoulders. But when Aristide learned about the bullying from the other boys at the school, he grew concerned. "We need to look into this kid," Aristide told Marco one afternoon, his voice calm yet carrying an unmistakable edge. "If he's hurting Jeremy, there's a reason, and we're going to find out what that is." Marco, Vito, and Luca, each loyal to Aristide in ways that went beyond their work, began digging into Nicholas's life. They had the resources, the network, and the skill to uncover things that most people could only guess at. It didn't take long for them to find out that Nicholas wasn't just a bully, he was a boy in pain. His father, a prominent lawyer in the city, had been absent for as long as anyone could remember. Nicholas's mother had passed away when he was just 8, leaving him alone in a cold, emotionally neglectful home. The boy had been left to raise himself, with no guidance, no emotional support. Aristide's men had uncovered the truth in minutes. Nicholas's aggression wasn't born out of malice. It was born from grief. Grief that had been left to fester, unchecked, for years. Aristide was no stranger to pain. His life had been full of loss of family, loss of loved ones, and loss of innocence. He knew what it was like to be broken and to carry scars that nobody could see. So, when he learned the truth about Nicholas, he saw something that struck a chord deep within him. "We can't leave him to suffer like this," Aristide said, his voice softer than it had ever been. "We'll reach out to him. He needs to understand that his pain doesn't have to turn into violence." Aristide was no therapist, and neither were his men, but they knew strength in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. And this boy, like Jeremy, needed protection. He needed guidance. So, they decided to offer him a chance at redemption, a way to change before it was too late. The next day, Aristide's men found Nicholas outside of school, waiting by the gates as usual. He wasn't alone. There were a couple of his friends with him. the ones who usually joined in tormenting Jeremy. But this time, it was different. Marco and Luca approached Nicholas, their presence intimidating but not hostile. They didn't immediately confront him. Instead, they offered him something that no one had offered him before: a chance to talk. "We know things haven't been easy for you," Marco said, his voice steady. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Nicholas, who had always been the one dishing out the insults, stood frozen. For the first time in years, someone was looking at him, not as a problem, but as a person. His defensiveness dropped, just for a moment. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion. "We see you, Nicholas," Luca added, his tone firm but not unkind. "We've been where you are. We've had our own demons to fight. But fighting doesn't mean tearing other people down." The words landed differently this time. Nicholas had spent so long pushing people away, trying to numb his pain with cruelty, that he didn't know how to react to this sudden show of understanding. For a long moment, there was silence. The other boys, confused by the shift in the atmosphere, watched as Nicholas stood before the Mafia men, their eyes full of curiosity and suspicion. But Nicholas wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Marco and Luca, his eyes wide, as though seeing them for the first time. "I don't need your help," Nicholas muttered, his voice breaking slightly. But the cracks in his tough exterior were becoming more visible. The walls he had built around himself, walls made of anger and deflection, were beginning to crumble. "You don't have to admit you need help," Marco said. "But we're here to show you that you don't have to keep doing this. We've all been broken before. But we learned to rebuild." Aristide's men were offering something powerful, an alternative to Nicholas's suffering, a way out of the bitterness that had consumed him for so long. Jeremy had overheard parts of the conversation from the shadows. He hadn't expected to see the Mafia reaching out to the boy who had tormented him for so long. He had been conflicted for days, unsure of how to feel about Nicholas. Part of him wanted to hate him forever, to carry the grudge for all the times Nicholas had pushed him into lockers or called him names. But another part of him, the part that had learned from Aristide and his men, began to see things differently. Nicholas wasn't just a bully. He was a victim in his own right, hurt, lost, and desperate for attention, just like Jeremy had been before the Gallos had come into his life. Jeremy could feel his anger fading, replaced with something far more complicated: compassion, understanding. It wasn't easy. Forgiving someone who had made his life miserable wasn't something Jeremy could do overnight. But Aristide had taught him one of the most important lessons of all. Strength wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about letting go of what weighed you down. So, when Nicholas approached him later that day, eyes red and voice hesitant, Jeremy didn't push him away. Instead, he met his gaze and nodded. "You want to talk?" Jeremy asked, his voice steady. "I get it. You're not the only one who's had it rough." Nicholas, for the first time, didn't argue or scoff. He sat beside Jeremy, the two of them in the shadows of the schoolyard, and for the first time, both of them felt the weight of their pasts starting to lift. Jeremy had never been more dreading a day in his life than the upcoming career day at school. The day, meant to be a celebration of parents and their professions, had always been a reminder of what he lacked. His classmates would walk in with their proud parents, showing off their lives and their achievements. And Jeremy, he would be walking in alone, the only one without a parent to stand by his side. He had no one to bring. The thought of sitting there, exposed and vulnerable, with the eyes of his classmates on him, filled him with dread. The cruelty he had suffered at school was never more obvious than on days like these. Nicholas, the bully, would always take pleasure in pointing out that Jeremy didn't have a father. "What's your dad do, orphan boy?" Nicholas would jeer, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The other kids would laugh, a cold, mocking sound that made Jeremy want to disappear. He had spent years learning to avoid being seen, to avoid being the center of attention. The idea of being under the spotlight once again, with no one to defend him, made his stomach churn. But this year was different. This year, Jeremy had Aristide and his crew, his new family, standing behind him. Aristide had known the significance of this day long before Jeremy even mentioned it. When he heard about Career Day, he made a decision that Jeremy never could have predicted. "We'll go," Aristide said, his voice quiet but resolute. "Not just you, Jeremy. All of us." Each of the Mafia members, including Vito, Marco, and Luca, would come to school, each bringing their own skill or profession to share. It was an unexpected plan, one that would defy the expectations of the whole school and send a message far louder than words ever could. They weren't just going to show up for Jeremy, they were going to stand by him, in front of everyone, and make sure he knew he wasn't alone. Jeremy could hardly believe it. Aristide's men, the same men who had lived through battles, both physical and emotional, were about to sit in a classroom in front of the entire school. It was beyond anything he had ever dreamed. He had spent so many years avoiding attention, wishing to fade into the background, but now he was being thrust into the center of it. He would walk into the room with Aristide, Vito, Marco, and Luca, all of them ready to show the world what family truly meant. It was a show of loyalty, a demonstration of their belief that he was worth more than the cruel jabs of his classmates. But even as Jeremy clung to the hope that this could be the moment that changed everything, doubt began to creep in. The closer the day got, the more the familiar fear crept into his chest. What if the Mafia didn't show up? What if they backed out at the last minute, leaving him standing alone as he had always feared? He had come to trust Aristide and his men, but part of him was still a scared boy who had learned to expect disappointment. Could they really understand what this meant to him? Could they truly understand the weight of walking into that classroom, not just with a group of tough Mafia men, but with a family that loved him? The days leading up to career day were filled with a gnawing anxiety that Jeremy could not shake. His heart would race as he thought about the possibility of being humiliated in front of everyone. He had already made a plan in his head. He would avoid the spotlight as much as he could, maybe sit in the back and keep his head down. But that plan felt weaker and weaker each time he thought about it. He wanted to believe in Aristide's promise, but the world had taught him time and time again not to expect much. The doubt ate at him, and the closer the day came, the more his stomach turned with fear and uncertainty. Finally, the morning of career day arrived, and Jeremy stood in front of the mirror, his clothes perfectly neat but his heart heavy with doubt. His backpack felt heavier than usual, the weight of the day's expectations pressing down on him. As he made his way to the school, he tried to steady his nerves, but the familiar feeling of being an outsider, of being alone in a room full of people who didn't understand, was overwhelming. The sounds of the school hallway, the chatter of students preparing for the day, only amplified the fear in his chest. What if he was still that boy who nobody cared about? What if, when the time came, the Mafia didn't show up? When the first bell rang, signaling the start of the day, Jeremy made his way to his classroom. His classmates were already gathered, some chatting with their parents, others eagerly waiting for the presentations to begin. Nicholas was there, smirking as usual, his father, tall, well-dressed, and proud, standing beside him. Jeremy could feel the heat of his gaze, the mockery that never seemed to fade. His seat was at the front, facing the door, and the sight of it made his chest tighten. It was the place where he had always been vulnerable. The place where, for years, he had been made to feel small. But as he took his seat, the familiar rumble of motorcycles began to echo in the distance. Jeremy's heart skipped a beat. He tried to focus on the front of the room, tried to keep his composure, but the noise grew louder. The unmistakable sound of engines roaring filled the air. One by one, the motorcycles pulled into the school parking lot, their engines synchronized, and Jeremy's heart pounded in his chest. They were here. They had actually shown up. The door to the classroom opened, and one by one, Aristide, Marco, Vito, and Luca walked in, their presence commanding the room. The other students froze, their chatter dying instantly as they looked at the Mafia members in shock. Aristide, tall and imposing, led the group with a calm authority, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Jeremy. Behind him, Marco carried a bag of tools, Vito had a briefcase, and Luca held a stack of books. The classroom was silent, every student, every teacher, staring in disbelief at the sight of the Mafia bosses in the middle of their school. Jeremy felt the weight of their presence, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the oppressive weight of fear. It was a weight of protection. Aristide smiled at Jeremy, a silent reassurance that, for this moment, he would never be alone again. The Mafia didn't just show up, they took their places, ready to speak about their work, their lives, and their loyalty. They were there to make sure Jeremy knew he mattered. They were there to show the entire school that he was no longer the boy who walked alone. The room was still in shock, but for Jeremy, the moment had arrived. The moment when he wasn't just a boy with a black eye, he was a boy with a family who would stand by him, no matter the cost. Have you ever had a moment when someone showed up for you in a way you never expected? How did it make you feel? Share your thoughts below. If you're enjoying Jeremy's journey and want to see what happens next, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Do you think the Mafia will change Jeremy's life for good? We can't wait to hear your thoughts. The morning of career day had already been filled with enough tension to choke Jeremy. He sat in the front row of his classroom, his hands trembling as he stared at the empty door, willing it to open and bring the relief he desperately needed. His classmates were already gathered with their parents, talking and laughing as though everything was normal. Nicholas stood at the back with his father, the two of them exchanging quiet words, while the other kids bragged about their family achievements. The feeling of isolation settled over Jeremy once more, a familiar weight he had never fully shaken. He had started to think that maybe the Mafia wouldn't show up, that perhaps, like everyone else, they would let him down. But then, just as the clock ticked toward the beginning of the presentations, the rumble of engines broke through the dull chatter of the classroom. The sound was low at first, like distant thunder, but it grew louder by the second. The vibrations shook the floor beneath his feet, and Jeremy's heart leapt into his throat. It was the sound of motorcycles, powerful, synchronized, unmistakable. A chill ran through him, but this time, it wasn't the cold grip of fear. It was the thrill of something new, something different. Aristide had promised they would be there, and now they were. As the motorcycles rolled into the parking lot, Jeremy felt his body freeze in place. 32 men, dressed in black leather jackets, their bikes gleaming in the overcast light, pulled into the school lot. They were a sight that could not be ignored, their presence so commanding that even the most skeptical student couldn't help but stare in awe. The roar of the engines reverberated through the school, echoing in the hallways, making the windows rattle and the air vibrate with anticipation. Aristide, Vito, Marco, Luca, and the rest of the Mafia were here. They had come in full force, not just for Jeremy, but to make a statement, to show the world that he was part of something that mattered. The students stopped what they were doing and turned to the windows, their eyes wide in disbelief. The Mafia's arrival was more than just a spectacle, it was a declaration. Aristide led the group with quiet confidence, his imposing figure towering over everyone else as he walked through the school doors. The group of 32 men filed in behind him, their leather jackets and sunglasses adding to their intimidating appearance. But there was no violence, no aggression, only a calm, controlled power that filled the room as they entered. They didn't walk like criminals, they walked like family, united, strong, and unbreakable. The room fell into stunned silence as they moved toward the front, their every step echoing in the hall. It wasn't just their size or their presence that commanded attention, it was the quiet loyalty they exuded, the unwavering support they gave without question. For Jeremy, it was a moment that made everything feel different. He had always felt small in a room full of people, a silent observer of the world around him, always on the outside. But as Aristide and his crew stood before him, something inside Jeremy shifted. He looked around at the Mafia members, each one different, each one carrying their own story, yet all united in their commitment to protect him, and felt something he had never felt before, a deep sense of belonging. His heart swelled as he realized, for the first time, that he wasn't just part of the Mafia's world by chance. He was a part of their family. He wasn't just the orphan boy anymore. He was someone worth protecting, someone who had finally found a place where he truly belonged. The students in the room, who had watched with wide eyes as the Mafia entered, now looked to Jeremy, their gazes filled with confusion and awe. Nicholas, the bully who had tormented him for years, stood frozen, his expression unreadable. His father, who had always been so proud and distant, stood awkwardly beside him, unsure of how to react. The other kids, who had never known what it meant to stand up for someone, were speechless. They had witnessed something powerful, something that defied their understanding of the world. They had expected Jeremy to be alone, as he always had been, but instead, they saw 32 men standing beside him, men who were more than just Mafia. They were his family, his protectors, and they were there for him when no one else had ever been. For the first time in his life, Jeremy felt the weight of his fear lift. It wasn't just that Aristide and the others had come to career day, it was that they had come for him, to show the world that he mattered. They weren't there to intimidate or cause trouble, they were there to demonstrate the strength of their loyalty, the depth of their commitment to one another. Aristide, his face calm and steady, looked directly at Jeremy and gave him a small, reassuring smile. In that moment, Jeremy knew that he was no longer just a scared, lonely boy. He was part of something that was bigger than himself, something that could not be broken. As the Mafia members began to introduce themselves to the class, explaining their various roles in the world of business, protection, and community service, Jeremy couldn't help but smile. He had never imagined that something so powerful, so meaningful, could be tied to a group of men who had once seemed like nothing more than dangerous criminals. Aristide spoke first, explaining his role as a leader and his involvement in several business ventures, some legal, some not, but always with the goal of providing for those who were loyal to him. Vito shared his work in organizing charity events, Marco spoke about his legal work for the family, and Luca explained how he had helped run the community outreach programs that the Mafia had been involved in. Each man contributed in his own way, showing that the Mafia wasn't just about intimidation and fear, it was about giving back, building a community, and standing up for the people who mattered. Jeremy couldn't believe the power of what he was witnessing. He wasn't just sitting at the back of the classroom anymore, watching others with envy. He was sitting at the front, surrounded by the very people who had shown him what true strength meant. They were not just showing up for him, they were showing the world that he was someone worth standing up for. And as Aristide finished speaking, he looked to Jeremy, his eyes filled with pride. "This," Aristide said, "is what loyalty looks like. This is what family looks like." The room, still in stunned silence, slowly began to process the impact of what had just happened. Jeremy wasn't just the boy with the black eye anymore. He was the boy with a family that would always be there, no matter what. As the days passed after career day, Jeremy's world slowly but surely began to shift. What had once felt like an overwhelming, dangerous world filled with shadows and threats was now becoming a place of strength, support, and understanding. Aristide and his men had shown him that strength wasn't just about power or fear, it was about resilience, loyalty, and the willingness to protect those who mattered. The Mafia, for all their rough exteriors and violent pasts, were teaching him something far more important than he had ever known. Aristide, Marco, Vito, and Luca would talk with him late into the evening, sharing their stories of survival, their struggles, and their unwavering commitment to the family they had built. Each story was different, yet the message was always the same. True power comes from being there for others, from standing strong in the face of adversity, and from never backing down when it matters most. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table in the mansion, Aristide shared a story that stuck with Jeremy long after the conversation had ended. "When I was younger," Aristide began, his voice low but filled with a quiet strength, "I learned what real power meant. It wasn't the strength of my fists or the fear I could instill in others. It was the ability to get up after every fall, to keep moving forward even when the world was against me. That's what makes a man strong, his resilience. And loyalty? That's the glue that holds everything together." The words struck Jeremy like a blow to the chest. He had never thought about strength that way before. To him, strength had always meant being tough, being able to take the hits and keep going. But now he was beginning to understand that strength wasn't just about surviving, it was about standing tall, being emotionally strong enough to protect what mattered most, and never giving up. The next few days brought new changes for Jeremy, as he started to see himself differently. He was no longer just the scared boy hiding in the shadows of his past. Aristide's words, the lessons from the Mafia members, were sinking in deeper than he realized. Jeremy started standing a little taller, feeling a new sense of purpose and confidence that had been absent for most of his life. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't easy. He still found himself haunted by the scars of his past, the trauma of living with Dale, the bullying at school, but with each passing day, he grew more aware of the power he now had. The power to speak up for himself. The power to stand his ground. The power to change his life. The first test of his newfound confidence came at school. Nicholas, ever the bully, tried his usual tactics, mocking, taunting, shoving. But this time, Jeremy didn't shrink back. He didn't flinch or look down at the ground, hoping to disappear. Instead, he met Nicholas's gaze, his back straight, his hands steady. "I'm not scared of you anymore," Jeremy said, his voice calm but firm. Nicholas, surprised by the shift in Jeremy's demeanor, backed off for the first time. Jeremy didn't know what had come over him, but for the first time, he realized that he didn't need to be scared anymore. The power that Aristide and the others had shown him wasn't just about physical strength, it was about having the confidence to face down the things that once terrified him. Back at the mansion, Aristide had noticed the change in Jeremy. The boy was starting to carry himself differently, his posture more confident, his gaze more assured. Aristide had always seen potential in Jeremy, but now he could see it beginning to flourish. "You're starting to get it, Jeremy," Aristide said one night as they sat together. "You're learning what it means to stand tall, not just for yourself, but for the people you care about. That's the true measure of strength." The words resonated with Jeremy as he sat quietly, reflecting on everything he had learned. He was no longer the broken boy who had walked into Aristide's mansion. He was becoming someone new, someone stronger, more self-assured. He wasn't just learning to survive anymore, he was learning to live. Jeremy's transformation didn't go unnoticed by the other members of the Mafia. Vito, Marco, and Luca, each of whom had taken their own hard paths to redemption, saw the boy they had taken in blossoming into someone with real strength. They weren't just protecting him from the world, they were helping him become a part of it. "You've got it in you, kid," Luca said one evening after a long day of training, where Jeremy had learned the basics of self-defense. "You've got more power than you know. The key is to use it for the right reasons." Marco, ever the strategist, pulled him aside to talk. "It's not enough to be strong, Jeremy. You have to use that strength wisely. You've got a lot of people backing you up now, don't waste that." Vito, who had always been the one to show the most affection, clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You're part of this family now, kid. And we don't let each other fall." But even as Jeremy's confidence grew, the shadows of his past still lingered. The emotional scars, the fear of rejection, the memories of Dale's cruelty, they weren't gone. They couldn't be. But Jeremy was learning how to live with them, how to use them as fuel instead of letting them control him. He wasn't going to let his past define him. Aristide and the Mafia had taught him that resilience meant not letting the weight of his history drag him down. His past had been full of darkness, but it didn't have to be his future. One evening, as the sun set over the mansion, Jeremy stood at the window, looking out at the city below. He could hear the distant rumble of the motorcycles, the same motorcycles that had arrived on career day. Aristide and his men were down in the yard, laughing and talking, their voices carrying through the night air. For the first time, Jeremy didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The fear, the doubt, the isolation, it was all slowly fading away. In its place was something new. Something powerful. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living, and he was ready for whatever came next. The day Dale's downfall began was a day Jeremy would remember for the rest of his life. Aristide and his men had carefully orchestrated every detail, pulling strings and using every piece of evidence they had gathered to expose Dale for the monster he truly was. Jeremy had spent years dreading this moment, never knowing if he would live long enough to see the man who had tormented him be held accountable for his actions. But now, with the Mafia's intervention, everything was falling apart for Dale. The police arrived at his doorstep early one morning, a small army of officers prepared to take him in, his world collapsing in real time. The evidence against Dale was undeniable. The photos of Jeremy's bruises, the text messages from Dale threatening Jeremy's mother, the medical records showing signs of abuse, everything had been carefully documented. Aristide had made sure that every detail of Dale's cruelty was exposed for the world to see. When the police entered his home, they found the files, evidence that painted a picture of a man who had been hiding behind his power for far too long. Dale tried to put up a fight, but it was no use. The network that Aristide had set in motion had already done its work, and there was nowhere for him to hide. The lies that had allowed him to maintain control over Jeremy for so long were now unraveled. As the news of Dale's arrest spread through the town, Jeremy felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him felt relief that the man who had spent years making his life a living nightmare was finally going to face consequences. But there was also a sense of emptiness, a hollow feeling that lingered as he realized how deeply Dale's abuse had scarred him. For years, he had lived in fear of this man, and now that fear was gone, leaving him with the weight of what had been done to him. Aristide had promised him freedom, but that didn't mean the wounds of the past would heal overnight. Still, for the first time, Jeremy felt like he had control over his life. He wasn't the victim anymore. He was free, and that freedom felt like a new beginning. The relief was not just about Dale's removal from his life, it was about the changes that came afterward. Jeremy had never truly understood the impact of a safe environment until he found one. The constant tension in his home, the fear that came with every step around Dale, was gone. At first, it was hard for Jeremy to let go of the vigilance he had lived with for so long. But every day, he felt himself relax just a little more. Aristide and his men had created a new world for him, one where fear no longer controlled him. With Dale gone, Jeremy began to see his mother in a new light. She was still recovering from her own wounds, but now there was a chance for them to rebuild their relationship, one step at a time. The burden of her own trauma had been lifted, and for the first time in years, they could both breathe. The support that Aristide and his men provided wasn't just physical, it was emotional, too. They made sure Jeremy had everything he needed to heal, both physically and mentally. There were sessions with counselors, conversations with Marco and Luca about the importance of emotional resilience, and countless hours of just being there when Jeremy needed to talk. Aristide had never claimed to be a therapist, but he understood the power of showing up when it mattered. He knew that the scars on Jeremy's soul were just as real as the bruises on his body. The healing process was slow, and it wasn't always linear, but it was real. For the first time in his life, Jeremy began to understand that it was okay to feel, to let himself be vulnerable, and that strength didn't always come from keeping everything inside. The healing wasn't just about what had been taken from Jeremy, it was about what he could now build for himself. He started taking small steps toward a life that didn't revolve around fear. He reconnected with friends he had distanced himself from during the darkest parts of his life. At school, he stood taller, no longer shrinking from the world around him. He didn't have to keep his head down anymore. The world had changed for him, but more importantly, Jeremy was beginning to see that he had the power to change his own world. He wasn't the broken boy who had walked into Aristide's mansion. He was stronger, more self-assured, and ready to take on whatever came next. Even as his own healing progressed, Jeremy saw the impact of his transformation on those around him. His mother, who had always been caught between her own survival and her love for Jeremy, began to change. She started attending therapy, working through her own pain, and slowly, she became the mother he had always longed for. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't happen overnight, but for the first time in a long while, they both felt like they had a future to look forward to. Aristide and his men had done more than remove the immediate threat from their lives. They had opened the door to something better. It wasn't just the end of Dale's reign, it was the beginning of Jeremy's new life, one where he could finally have the childhood he deserved. The Mafia, for all their flaws and criminal dealings, had given him the most important gift of all, freedom. Freedom from fear. Freedom from abuse. and the chance to live a life that was finally his to shape. Aristide, ever the protector, continued to check in on him, but Jeremy no longer saw himself as a victim. He saw himself as someone who had been given a second chance. And as he sat in the living room one evening, surrounded by the family he had never expected to have, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The darkness of his past was fading, and in its place was a new life, one full of possibility. Have you ever had to let go of something from your past to truly move forward? What helped you break free from the hold it had on you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you're following Jeremy's journey and want to see how he continues to rebuild his life, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment. How do you think he'll handle the challenges that are still ahead? Let us know what you think. The day of Jeremy's graduation felt like the culmination of everything he had worked so hard for, but it was also a new beginning. The familiar sounds of the school hallway, the chatter of students preparing for the ceremony, seemed strangely distant as he stood at the entrance of the gymnasium. The cap and gown felt heavy, but not in the way they had during his first year at the school. Back then, he had been the scared, broken boy who barely spoke to anyone, unsure of where he belonged. But now, as he stood there, ready to step into a new chapter of his life, he could feel the shift in himself. The fear, the self-doubt, the trauma from his past, it had all been slowly but surely replaced with something stronger: confidence. He was no longer the boy who had been beaten down by life. He was the young man who had learned what true strength meant. Jeremy's eyes scanned the gymnasium as the ceremony began. The students, most of them nervous, some of them excited, filled the seats. The stage at the front of the room was decorated with balloons and banners, the bright colors a stark contrast to the dark days Jeremy had lived through. He could see his mother in the crowd, her face filled with pride, her eyes not as tired as they once had been. Jeremy knew that she had come a long way too, that this day was just as much about her recovery as it was about his own. Behind her, Aristide and his men sat quietly, looking out of place, but perfectly at ease in the sea of parents. They weren't just there to watch. They were there to witness the final piece of Jeremy's journey, the moment when he no longer needed to be protected. He was ready to stand on his own. As the principal called the names of the graduates, Jeremy's heart pounded. The nerves returned, but they were different this time. It wasn't fear that gripped him, it was anticipation. He had spent so many years in the shadows, unsure of his place in the world, but now, in this moment, he could feel the light shining on him. When his name was called, he walked up to the stage with his head held high, each step a reminder of how far he had come. The applause from the crowd felt like a distant echo as he took his diploma. He smiled to himself, feeling a surge of pride wash over him. It wasn't just about the diploma. It was about the journey that had led him here. The boy who had once been invisible was now standing tall, ready to face whatever came next. Later, as the ceremony ended, the graduates gathered for their speeches. It was Jeremy's turn. He had prepared for this moment, rehearsing the words in his head over and over. He had no idea how it would feel to speak in front of the entire school, but as he stepped to the microphone, the fear that once would have paralyzed him was nowhere to be found. Instead, he felt a quiet strength settle in his chest. The words that came out were clear, steady, and filled with a wisdom he hadn't known he possessed. "When I walked into this school, I didn't think I'd make it out," Jeremy began, his voice carrying through the microphone. "I didn't think I had anyone. I thought I was alone. But then I found something I didn't expect, a family. A family that showed up for me when no one else did. I learned that family isn't just about blood, it's about loyalty, support, and love." Jeremy paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. He could see the students who had once mocked him, now watching him in awe. Even Nicholas, who had once been his tormentor, looked at him differently now. "My family is not like most families," Jeremy continued. "They didn't just protect me physically, they showed me how to be strong, how to stand up for myself, how to believe in who I am. I owe everything to them. They taught me that real strength isn't about fighting, it's about protecting the people you love, about standing up for what's right, and about being loyal to those who stand by you." He let the words sink in. He wasn't just speaking to the room full of people. He was speaking to himself, reminding himself of everything he had overcome. The applause that followed felt different this time, more genuine, more earned. Jeremy stood at the front of the room, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It wasn't just the recognition he was enjoying, it was the realization that he had earned it. He had fought for this moment, and now he was standing tall in front of everyone, unafraid. Aristide, sitting in the back of the room, watched with pride. He knew the journey Jeremy had been on, knew how much it had taken for the boy to get here. Aristide had always seen the potential in Jeremy, but now, watching him speak with such confidence, he knew that Jeremy was no longer just the boy who had been rescued. He was a young man ready to take on the world. As the ceremony wrapped up, Jeremy walked back to his seat, feeling lighter than he had in years. His mother stood up to hug him, her arms tight around him. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Jeremy smiled, knowing that this moment, this day, was not just the end of a chapter, it was the beginning of everything he had always wanted. The pain of his past was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He had the strength to move forward, and with the support of his family, his Mafia family, there was nothing he couldn't face. Aristide stood up from his seat as Jeremy returned to the crowd, his eyes meeting the boys'. He didn't need to say anything, Jeremy already knew what he meant. The bond they shared, the bond that had been built on loyalty, protection, and love, would never break. Aristide had given him the tools to survive, to thrive, but now it was up to Jeremy to decide what came next. And Jeremy was ready. He wasn't the boy who had walked into Aristide's mansion all those months ago. He was a young man who had learned the true meaning of strength, of family, and of standing tall in the face of adversity. The days after Jeremy's graduation were a blur of new beginnings. He had stepped into adulthood with the weight of his past still present, but no longer controlling him. Aristide and his Mafia family continued to stand by him, just as they had from the moment he had walked into their world. The fear and uncertainty he had once felt about his future had transformed into hope. His life, once defined by brokenness and isolation, was now filled with promise, and it was all because of the family he had found in the most unexpected place, with men who had seen the worst of the world and still chose to protect those they loved. Aristide, Marco, Vito, and Luca, the men who had once seemed like distant figures of power and fear, had become more than just protectors. They had become his foundation, the people who had shown him the true meaning of family. Jeremy spent the summer following his graduation figuring out what he wanted for his future. With the support of Aristide's family, he felt like he could finally make choices for himself. They encouraged him to explore his passions, to take risks, and to understand that his past didn't have to define his future. Aristide, ever the mentor, sat him down one afternoon and said, "You've learned what it means to be strong, Jeremy. Now it's time to decide what kind of man you want to be." Those words stuck with Jeremy as he thought about his next steps. He had grown up with an idea of strength based on survival, but now he realized that true strength came from choice, choosing who he wanted to be, what he wanted to stand for, and how he would use his past to shape the future he wanted. Aristide and the other members of the Mafia continued to offer Jeremy guidance, but they also gave him space to grow. They weren't trying to control his future, but rather to empower him to make his own decisions. Jeremy started taking classes at the local community college, studying business and law, both areas that fascinated him. He had learned from Aristide that loyalty and leadership were important, and he wanted to understand how to wield that power responsibly. As he sat in his first lecture, surrounded by students who had no idea about his past, he couldn't help but feel a quiet pride. He wasn't the scared, bruised boy anymore. He was a young man with a future, one that he could build on his own terms. Despite the challenges ahead, Jeremy knew he wasn't alone. The Mafia family that had embraced him from the very beginning remained a constant presence in his life. They weren't just his protectors. They were his teachers, his guides, and his support system. They had shown him what true loyalty looked like, what it meant to have someone who would always show up for you, no matter the cost. Aristide, in particular, had become something of a father figure to him. While Jeremy had come to him with the hope of finding protection, he had found something deeper, a man who valued strength, loyalty, and family above all else. Aristide's guidance had shaped Jeremy into someone who could face the world with confidence, knowing that he would always have a place to return to. The bond between Jeremy and the Mafia family had only grown stronger as time went on. They had become an inseparable part of his life, showing him that family wasn't just about blood, it was about the people who choose to stand by you, no matter what. Jeremy had seen the scars they all carried, and he understood that their loyalty wasn't just a byproduct of shared interests, it was built on shared pain, shared survival. They had chosen each other, and now they had chosen him. That wasn't something he took lightly. Every time he looked around and saw Aristide, Vito, Marco, or Luca, he was reminded that family could be found in the most unlikely places. As the months passed, Jeremy found himself stepping into a new role within the Mafia's network. He wasn't just the boy they had rescued anymore. He was a trusted member of their world, someone they looked to for advice and leadership. He didn't carry the same weight of fear that he once had. Instead, he carried the weight of responsibility. Aristide had shown him that power didn't come from intimidation or fear, it came from earning trust, offering loyalty, and standing up for those who couldn't stand for themselves. Jeremy took those lessons to heart as he began to navigate the complex world of business and law that the Mafia had introduced him to. Through it all, Jeremy knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would never have to face them alone. The Mafia, his family, would always be there. They had shown him the power of protection, of unconditional loyalty, and of what it meant to stand together. When things got tough, Aristide was always there to offer guidance, Marco to provide counsel, Luca to offer a steady hand, and Vito to remind him of the importance of looking out for those you love. They weren't just his family by title, they were his family by choice, and that meant more to him than anything else in the world. One evening, as Jeremy stood on the balcony of the mansion, looking out over the city, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had come so far from the scared boy who had first walked through the doors of Aristide's world. The shadows of his past were still there, but they no longer controlled him. They had become part of who he was, but not the definition of who he was becoming. Aristide joined him on the balcony, standing beside him in silence. He didn't need to say anything, Jeremy knew what he meant. The bond they shared, the family they had built, was unbreakable. As Jeremy turned to face Aristide, he smiled, a real smile this time, not the forced one he had once worn to hide his pain. "Thank you," Jeremy said, his voice steady. "For everything. I don't know where I'd be without you and the others." Aristide gave a small, approving nod. "You found your way, Jeremy. We just showed you the path." With that, they stood together in the quiet of the night, looking out at the future, a future that Jeremy could now face with confidence, knowing that no matter what happened, his family would always be there to support him. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.